Today's daf Bez Hashem is Masechta Menachos Daf Nun Daled 54, and we will begin on Daf Nun Gimel Amud Beis. Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir says, so we're talking about the different menachos that needed to be made into chametz. So in order to make something chametz, you need a leavening agent, and therefore, how do you create a leavening agent? So Rabbi Meir said, there is a problem with every time you can't just add a leavening agent. If I put a leavening, if the Torah tells you that it has to be exactly isaron. So if it's exactly isaron, if I add a leavening agent to it, then I'm more than isaron. So how do you make this turn into chametz? So after you measure it, you remove some of the flour, and you just quickly soak it in water, and then you preserve it a little bit with the flour, and then you put it back in. Somehow you started the fermentation process and created a makeshift leavening agent from within the flour itself. That was the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda and says, that's not going to leaven the bread. It's not going to make a good leavening agent. A leavening agent is something that was aged for a little bit. So what you do is you create according to Rabbi Yehuda, you brought a leavening agent from your house. Let us call a leavening agent over here. We're going to call a leavening agent at the bottom. An old leavening agent, you put it into the test tube over here. Right over here, a leavening agent, and then you add the flour up to the isarin number. That was Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So you have a proper leavening agent this flour was aged a long time ago, and then you put it into the tube, and then you fill it up with fresh flour, and there you'll be able to leaven all this flour with this leavening agent on the bottom. The problem is, and we're going to say that in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that according to that, you're going to be missing from the flour. In other words, it's not going to be exactly in a saroin, because the consistency of this leavening agent is very different than the flour itself. Suppose this leavening agent was made with a lot of water. So then, if it was made with a lot of water, there's a lot of expand. There's more water in the airspace. There's a lot of it separates the particles of the leavening agent, which makes it very different than the rest of the flour. So it's not an exact isaron. It's actually, this has more airspace than the rest of the flour. So it's not exactly an isaron. And even if you use less water for this, so then it clumps it too much, so then you're going to have more flour taking the space. So you're going to either have less flour than in isaron or more flour than in isaron. So than in regular isaron. So that's what the Gemara's question is. That was the question against Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Meir, let's read it inside. Hasaor boidel mitoichan umachmitzan. Rabbi Sior, you take a leavening agent from within and then you bring it back in. And Rabbi Yehuda says that's not a good idea. So what was the problem that you're going to be missing or adding to the flour according to Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda also has a problem. Omer Rav Chizda says, Isas hasaor avo. If you put a lot of the saor of the leavening agent is thick, it's very thick, nimtzas yisera, then you're adding to it because it's clumped. Midas isaron raka, if the nimtzas chasera, so it's going to cause that the leavening agent is not of the same consistency as the rest of the flour, and therefore you're not going to have exactly the amount of isaron that you actually need. That's what the Gemara's question is. So the Gemara says, Saif kiko kyle soren kyle. When you originally put it in, you put it in when it originally was a flour. Uh, when you originally put it in for an isarin, it is an isarin. It turns out if you measure it, it's still going to be an isarin. So what's the problem? Answers the Gemara. Rabbi Yosef, the Amr Travayu, Rabbi Yosef both say the way it was. That's the way we are estimating it the way it is. The Gemara's question was: if you take a look at the picture, it's Isarin. What do I care if this was if this was once? At the end of the day, just look at the top measure. If it measures out to Isarin, that should be no problem. The answer is, you can't look at this the way it is right now. You have to look at it the way it was before. So it's very hard to determine how this leavening agent volume was once before, because it's a different leaven. It's different now because it's full of water. So therefore, I could really not measure properly the isarin. Wow. So again, it's so we're dealing with small, tiny amounts, but the Torah tells you that it has to be an isarin, and the Mishnah has a problem with the way Rabbi Yehuda wants to add a leavening agent. From some other dough that was aged for a long time, and that's going to mess up our counting for a nisaran. And according to a mayor, you're not going to get a good leavening agent if you just put the flour in and then create a leavening agent. Says the Gemara. Okay, so the Gemara says, let us fill it up with flour, regular flour. Okay, fill it up with regular flour. Then what we're going to do is remove the leavening, fill it, then take a little bit of the flour, take it outside, and somehow supercharge it to make it a leavening agent, and then bring it back in, and then add it on into the bowl later on. What's wrong with that? So the Gemara says, Gzeira, it's a Gzeira. People will see that you're adding to the bowl, and they will think that Isaron, you don't have to have exact Isaron. You could have more or less. It doesn't matter, because they see that you're adding to something that they think is an Isaron. They didn't know that you took off a little bit prior to that. Tanur Rabbanan. The rabbis taught. Okay, so you normally you make this dough with water, right, to make it chametz. Ein machmitzin, you can't use betapuchin with apple juice. Machmitzin, even using apple juice will make it chametz. Rav Chanana ben Masinlo, Rav Chanina ben Tradian. Rav Chanana said it's Rav Chanina ben Tradian, not Rav Chanina ben Gamliel, who said that apple juice could make chametz. But the Tanna Kama says you can't use apple juice because apple juice will not make the dough chametz. Who is the author of this Mishnah? Let's say a kohen had an apple and they crushed it up and they put it into a dough. Now it's somewhere mixed into a dough and it made the dough chametz. So now the dough doesn't mevatel the apple. So the whole dough becomes like truma. Hareze asura, so it's usher to eat for a non-kohen to eat that dough. Come on, who's the author of that? Well, Lema, Reb Chanina ben Gamliel, because only Reb Chanina ben Gamliel is the one that holds that a tapuach is a leavening agent, and therefore it doesn't become batal. Because the Tanna Kama holds a tapuach, apple juice, will not leaven a bread. So the author of that Mishnah is not the Rabbanan. It's a one opinion, Reb Chanina ben Gamliel or Reb Chanina ben Tradian. Answers the Gemara, feel the tame Rabbanan. You want to say it goes according to Rabbanan. Need the chametz gamar loyhava. Even if the Rabbanan say that apple juice does not make chametz gamar, nuksha miyahava. It makes chametz nuksha, like a low type of chametz. Rashi says, which is a type of chametz that somehow doesn't bloat, but it comes a little bit chametz. It starts the process and doesn't finish it. So therefore, that would be enough to asa the dough to a non-kohen, even if according to Rabbanan. So now we go to another topic. The Gemara says, Rabbi Ila says, a minchas chayta, because there's no, it's all dry, it's very hard to do a kmitza to it. So, and you couldn't add oil to it. So Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi Amar, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says, for a minchas chayta, what we do is megabla b'mayim kshera. We can add a little bit of water, and then it becomes kosher. And then it becomes kosher. So you're not going to add oil, but you're going to add water. Tanakama holds, the Rabbi Ila holds that you can add water. What's the machlokes? Lema b'hokam apalgi. One holds, you look at it the way it is right now. Okay. And therefore, if you're going to add water to it, then you're going to have too much of a shear. Umar Sava, but Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi holds, you look at the way it was. So even if you added water later on, you don't passel the mincha. So that's the question. When something grows in size, does that affect the kashrus of the mincha? According to Rabbi Ila, it would affect the kashrus of the mincha, so that we never added water to a minchas chayte. And Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi holds, no, even if you added water, you always look at the way it was, the size it was, and it was kosher. It was the exact size prior to you adding water. So that's what we thought the machlokes is. So the Gemara says, not so. The Kuli Alma, everybody holds Kamoy Shehain Mishar. You look at it the way it is right now. Kamoy Shehain Mishar, the way it is right now. Even though it's larger in size, so why does Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi say it's kosher? But that's the machlokes. The Marsova, one holds that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi held my charev. What does the Torah mean that you can add, make it dry? It means charev mishemen. It should be dry from oil, but you could add water. Marsova and the other holds charev mikol davar. It has to be dry from anything. I mean, you can't even add water. So that's the machlokes, if you could add water or not to this minchas chayte. Now we're going to go into a topic of this changing of the size. So the Gemara continues. Tanan Hasan, we learned over there. Now, one of the things that we need to know is that a piece of meat has to be the size of an olive in order to be Mekabel Toma, the one on the right here. If it's smaller than that, it's not Mekabel Toma, Tumas Oichlin. So the question is, what happens if it fluffed up in size? So do you look at it the way it was? So the Gemara says like this. Mishnah says, B'sar egel shnisfach. You have the meat of a calf that blew up and became the size of an olive. Or b'sar zakena shnismayach, or an old piece of meat that became smaller. So how do you view it in the terms of Tumas Oichlin? You look at it the way it was. If it was original in its original size, larger than an olive, it's Mekabel Tumas Oichlin. It's acceptable, even if right now it's smaller. But if it was not, it was smaller than a size of an olive, and then somehow it blew up, it will not be Mekabel Tuma. Because the Kamoy Shehen means you look at it the way it was in its original size. You look at it as its current size. Kamoy Shehen means its current size. Shmuel, Rav Shimon, Rav Lakish, the way it was its original size. So that's a very important question. You don't do you look at something, the piece of meat, the way it is right now, or do you look at it the way it was originally? So, and that will determine whether it's the size of an olive to be susceptible to tumah. Sometimes things change in size. So do you look at it right now, the size of it right now, or do you look at it what it was in its original state? So the Kamoy Shehen means you look at it the way it was in its original state, and Kamoy Shehen means you look at it the way it is right now. Says the Gemara Meisveit, let me ask you a question. The Brisa says a piece of meat that didn't have the shear. So it became like the Shir Kazayas tar l'shavar. In the original, we don't say it was makabel tuma, but the tame mikan labo. We say now that it grew in size, it's now become susceptible to tuma. So you see that you look at it, you look at to determine, you look at it the way it is right now, and right now it's over the size of an olive, so it becomes susceptible to tuma. So this is a question against the person that's the opinions that says the kamoishen, that you look at it the way it was its previous size, and it says the Gemara midrabanim, it's midrabanim. The midrabanim means true. We always look at the way it was in its previous size. That's the determining factor. But the Rabbanan said that you could look at it mikan la'ba. So it's only mikabel tuma d'Rabbanan. But on a deraisa level, it would not be mekabel tuma, even if it grew in size. Says the Gemara, Hachi, let's say, if you tell me midraisa level, it would not be mekabel tuma. The Raisa says that a pigel that grew to the size of a kazayas or nicer, you'll be chayiv kares. It seems that you'll be chayiv kares if you eat that size, even though in its original state it was less than a kazayas. If we're dealing with the raisa, that's why the raisa says pigel or nicer. Is there such a thing called pigel rabbanon? Chayiv kares midrabanan? There's no such a thing. So we're dealing with the raisa. So midaraisa, you look at it the way it is right now. Answers the Gemara, no. The Bryce is talking about drabbanans. And where is pigel nicer drabbanans? The pigel nicer drabbanans in the situation of being makabel metami your hands. The Bryce says pigel and nicer are matami your hands. So let's say a piece of pigel was less than the size of a kazayas, and then it grew into the size of a kazayas. That's what the Bryce is talking about. It will be matami your hands. And so it's not a dealing with the eating of the pigel and the eating of the nicer. It's just talking about whether your hands will become tamei touching it. And since the fact that your hands become tamei by touching a piece of pigel or nicer is anyway drabanim, so maybe kula high, if it grew in size, but the Rabbanim not going to make it, oh, now it grew in size, now it's going to matame your hands. Kamash Malan, that even if it grew in size, the Rabbanim will say that it will still be matame your hands. Tashma, come in here. Besides the kana, an old piece of meat, vitzamak, and then it became smaller. So pachos mikashir. So tamei l'shave, it was tamei in its original state, but now if it becomes tamei, tar mikal haba, it's tar right now. Even midrabanan, it's tar. So what do we see from there? That you always look at things kamoy shehain, the way it is right now. You always look at things kamoy shehain, and therefore that's why it's tar from right now. So now we have to flip the whole machlekes. Omar Rabba says, if it was original size of a kazayis, now it's less than a kazayis, halespa, it's nothing. It's not an iser, it's water, it's nothing. But if it's an original state, it was small, and the hashta hava bay, now it grew in size, right? If it grew in size, then Midrabanan will say Midrabanan it's Mikabel Tuma. So everybody agrees to those premises. We go to Amar Beis. Kipli, when are they arguing? You're going Shahoy by Kashir. It originally had the share, Vitsama, and then it became smaller than the share. Chaz of a tafach, and then it became larger than the share. So now for in between period, it became smaller than its original size. So it wasn't Mikabel Tuma. Now that it blew back up again, do you say now it could be Mikabel Tuma? The Marsava one holds Yesh Dicha B'Dairaisa. You look at the way it is, the way it originally Yesh Dicha B'Dairaisa, that since once it's pushed off from Isurim, so then it can never be Mikabel Tuma again, B'Dairaisa, only Midrabanan. So therefore, even though it had the sheer deraisa, and now it became smaller. So now midaraisa, it's not makabel tuma anymore. So it's not makabel tuma anymore. So even if it blows back up, it's still not going to be makabel tuma midaraisa on a deraisa level. Umar Sava, the other opinion holds, once something becomes pushed, but it returns to its original state, it would be mikabel tuma the araisa. Umi equal. So that is the machlokes between them. Do you look at it? Do you look at it at the in-between level, the way it was at the in-between level, and then it can never return to be Mikabel Tumah Daraisa? Or do you look at it now? You look at it the way it is, as its original level. It was a something that could be Mikabel Tumah, and so it stays that way. Just because there was an in-between time that it wasn't Mikabel Tumah. But now we learned in there's their opinion that holds is yesh dichim b'yisurim. But now we learned in the Mishnah, you have an egg that you put it into the sun, and it became nisma'atu. It became smaller. Okay. Everything became smaller. No problem. They're tahar. So far, so good. But what happens? You took that kazayas, became smaller, and you put it back into this rain. You put it back in the rain, and it blew up to mayim. Then they become tama. They become chayav. So we see that there's no such a thing of dichui when it comes to a daraisa thing. It returns to its daraisa level. So even though let's say this pigel was the size, then became smaller, and then grew back in size, it's still awesome in daraisa. So so this is a refutation according to the opinion that says once something is pushed off, it can never come back to its deraisa level. To Yufta, it's refuted. Tashma, come in here. I want to prove to you that you always look at things the way it is right now, in generally speaking. Brisa says, Tarmin te'enim al hagaraygas. The assumption is we're talking about maestros. So you're allowed to take off figs versus, you're allowed to take off truma on figs versus dried figs. Now, and how do you count? Let's say you're supposed to take 10%, exactly 10%. So you have 18 dried figs, 2 regular figs. So you take just 2 of the regular figs. You take 2 of the regular figs, although they're not the same size. That's what you see in the picture. Te'enim al agroigus b'minyan. You just count it. You take, if you have 8, let's say you have 20 figs in total, and 18 dried figs, 2 regular figs, non-dried figs, you take the 2 dried figs. You take the 2 regular figs. Now, if you always, then this always makes sense, because if you're looking at one point, these dried figs look like the regular figs. It look like the regular figs. So since these dried figs were once like regular figs, there's no problem. If you say l'kamay shehein, you always revert back to the way it was. But Eliamar kamay shehein, if you're going to say the way it is right now, so this is not really 10%. If you look at the picture, these 2 figs are not 10% of the 18 dried figs. These 2 figs are much more. And there's the problem with adding in maestros. Maestros has to be precise. Hamarba b'maestros, havale marba b'maestros. You're giving too much maestros. Hamarba b'maestros. If you give more than 10%, peiraisa musakanim, you fixed your fruits. But umaestros mikol kolam, the maestro is a problem. In other words, the Levi won't be able to eat these 2 figs because you're going to have a problem with the maestros. Not to go into it, but maestros has to be exactly 10%. So you have to have a very good accounting. So how does that work? So elamai. So what do you want to say that this Mishnah proves? L'kamay shehein. You always revert the way it was. Let's do the opposite case. Groigers alateinim b'mida. You should measure it. Now, let's say groigers alateinim. You have 2 figs versus 2 dried figs versus a lot of wet figs. So then you're giving less truma maestros, because if you go look at l'kamay shehein, I'm sorry, if you look at l'kamay shehein the way it was, so we assume that the dried figs look like the non-dried figs. Fine. But then you have to measure. It says you're supposed to add a little bit more because you do it by weight. But why can't they do it by number? because these figs, these dried figs, were once looking like the non-dried figs. But the Brisa says, no, you have to weigh it out because this weighs less. That's what the K'may Shehein, Ema Sefer, Gregorus Alatenim, if you're taking dried figs versus non-dried figs, b'mida, you have to weigh it. Yamra Bishlam K'may Shehein. If you want to say that you look at it the way it was shapir, then everything makes perfect sense. K'may Shehein the way it is right now. I'm sorry, K'may Shehein the way it is right now, shapir. Then it's not the same weight. It's not. You have to take a weight measure. El Yamra K'may Shehein, you look at the way it was. So if you look at the way it was, marba b'maiseris hu, then you're adding too much, because if you're going to add more of the dried figs onto what you have, you're going to weigh it, you're going to add more. So what's the Brisa talking about? Ella, you don't have a proof either way. We're talking about Truma Gedola. So we're talking about there, you don't have to be precise. Reisha ba'ayin yafa, v'seifa ba'ayin yafa. In the ratio, we want you to do the best. In the sefer, we want you to do the best. Truma gedola, we're talking about truma. So if we're talking about truma, so we want you to give the most to the kohen. We're not talking about mices. You don't have to be precise. So that's why you can give 2 regular figs in the first case, because you're ending up giving more to the kohen. There's no problem with that. Here, we want you to take a weight and add a little bit more dried figs over here, because we want you to give more to the kohen. So either way, we want you to give more to the kohen, and that's the whole idea of this Mishnah. If that's the case, if it's not talking about Maisers, Amos Sefer, let's look at the end of the Brisa. Rabbi Elazar bar Yaisi said, Rabbi Elazar bar Yaisi said, Maisa Abba, my dad, he used to take 10 dried figs for 90 non-dried figs in the basket. So it seems that the Brisa must be talking about maisrus. If we're talking about Truma Gedola, then why is he taking 10%? So it must be that the whole Brisa was talking about maisrus. Ella, yes, it's talking about 10%, but not every it's not Meiser is not the only thing that needs 10%. We're talking about Betrumas Meiser. We're talking about Trumas Meiser. Trumas Meiser is that the kohen of his Meiser has to give 10% off the Levi of his Meiser. The Levi, when he receives Meiser Rishon, has to give 10% to the kohen. That's called Trumas Meiser. That Trumas Meiser doesn't have to be exact. It's unlike regular Meiser, which has to be precise. Trumas Meiser does not have to be exact. Abba Elazar ben Goimel. It goes according to Abba Elazar ben Goimel. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa. Abba Elazar ben Goimel. Oima benechshav lechem trumaschem. B'shtei trumas hakasam mendaba. Achas trumas gedola v'achas trumas Meiser. And so Truma Gedola and Trumas Meiser have one of the same thing. Shem she Truma Gedola nitelas v'oima machshama. Kach Trumas Meiser nitelas v'oimed uv'machshava. And just like regular truma, you don't have to be. You can estimate and you can take any amount. By trumas meiser, I know you have to give 10%, but you don't have. You could if in your mind eye it looks like 10%, that's fine enough. You don't have to have an accountant there. And ma truma gedola b'ayin yafa, after trumas meiser b'ayin yafa, just like truma gedola, you give with a good eye. Try to give more. So trumas meiser, you try to give a little bit more than 10%. So since we're not dealing with precise measures, so that's the Brisa is not discussing K'may Shehen, the way it was, the way it's not. The Brisa is just telling you ideas. We always want you to give the most to the kohen. So in a case where you're giving non-dried figs versus dried figs, so then that's fine. You're giving a bigger amount to the kohen, even if we're dealing with Trumas Maestros. And if you're giving dried figs, we want you to weigh it. So make sure that you're giving 10%, maybe 12% to the kohen as well, that the Levi should give 12% to the kohen as well, to give ba'ayin yafa. So we just finished Be'ez Hashem, Daf Nun Dalet. Good Shabbos.